Okay, today we're going to talk about some of the major economic changes that began in Latin America, largely centered around the early 1900s, and the big political and social effects that those economic changes will have. So, the first section, we're actually going to go back to the 1800s and talk about the economic situation in Latin America real briefly in the 1800s, and as it starts to develop into a new set of policies amongst different countries in the late 1800s, and how those policies will lead to the big economic shifts, basically industrialization, and the massive social and political changes that those shifts will bring in going through the early 1900s up to about 1930 or so, really depending on exactly which country you're talking about. So we're going to describe those changes, and at the very end go through and talk about how those economic changes had big political effects in a certain few of the biggest and largely most important countries for these changes. So first thing is to go back into the 1800s and talk about the so-called Caudillo era. Latin American independence that got going in the 1820s largely ended the economic systems that Spain and Portugal had used to run their American colonies, which were largely based on control and monopolies, and imports and exports were very closely governed, and there were only a few kind of large trading voyages that went back and forth each year, and the government watched those voyages and watched what goods went into the Latin American markets and what came out to get exported for sale to Europe. So the European colonizers, especially Spain, largely viewed its American colonies as just money-making ventures that were intended to suck wealth and resources out of the Americas and bring it into Spain for the Spanish government to use for whatever goals it had at the time. So the Latin American economy was very heavily controlled by Spain for several hundred years up until independence in the 1820s. And when independence came around, a lot of these newly independent countries like Colombia or Venezuela or even Brazil or Haiti or Mexico start to open up their trade policies in order to get their economy going right from the start. So they view much more open, freer amounts of trade going on, kind of open ports, to be much more in the national interest for their newly independent countries than had ever existed under Spain. The problem with that, though, is that when you open up your trade, you also open up the opportunity for major economic powers like international businesses or domestic large landowners to take control over the regional economies in a certain country. And if they're able to do so, they can also wield huge political power by using the profits from their economic monopolies to basically dominate the government. And that'll happen, and we've seen that happen in many different Latin American countries when we talked about their experiences in the 1800s. So in the 1800s, most Latin American leaders basically looked inward. They looked at their own national development. They mostly wanted to develop their own political and economic institutions. Some of them dream about eventual industrialization, rather than contribute to some kind of larger international Latin American movement on the scale like Simon Bolivar had envisioned, to unite several large and powerful Latin American countries to dominate a whole region like the northern part of South America, as we see here in the map, and we've talked about several times before. So he was one of the few visionaries that dreamed of a kind of international movement of Latin Americans to combine their power and possibly therefore contest for a kind of larger role on the world stage. But most Latin American leaders after Bolivar basically fell back into their own nationalistic, independent development instead of any kind of large international movement. And they also largely fell back into their normal economies that had largely existed before independence. Most of the Spanish colonies, their economies were based in agriculture. They grew food, they raised animals, and they produced meat or grain or whatever their region was making off of the land. And most of the newly independent countries, their economies fell back into that subsistence farming type of paradigm that largely gave a lot of power to the big landowners because all the agriculture is based on the land. So whoever owns the land is kind of by default going to be the most wealthy and powerful people in the country. And those big landowners used that wealth to build political power, and that's what becomes known as the caudillo era, where basically the landowners run the countries. And the landowners argue with each other, as we saw in the 1800s, over specific policies or a new constitution, or sometimes start civil wars against each other to decide who the leadership's going to be. But it's largely power struggles amongst the landed elite. That will start to change in the late 1800s as the Latin American leaderships start coming up with individual plans, national plans, to try to bring industrialization to their country. And again, they're mostly doing this on their own, one country at a time level. This isn't any kind of big international movement to accomplish this. But when it starts to succeed in one place, one country, get other countries copy it basically pretty quickly. So this becomes known as the liberalism era. And the basic strategy was that a lot of Latin American governments individually plan to continue to use their agricultural-based economy to produce extra meat or grain or whatever their farmlands are producing. So they largely plan on producing more of it than their domestic economy needs for its own consumption, and to take the extra food or grain or whatever and sell out in the international marketplace, which is largely meant to send all that extra food or agricultural products to the industrializing centers of the world, largely Britain, Germany, the United States, basically to sell that stuff to those industrial centers who have gigantic populations, so they always need more food. Sell all of the excess food made in the Latin American country to those large population centers for money. And that the government would tax those sales as the money came back into the country, and that the government could use that tax revenue to reinvest in building industrial factories, to bring the Industrial Revolution basically to their country. So they could do that by straight up buying the technology and bringing it in to their country, or they could hire international experts or scientists or inventors or someone, pay them large salaries from the government to come into whatever country in Latin America and help design the Industrial Revolution and get it going. A lot of Latin American leaders also have another big economic powerhouse to contend with in their own country, and that's largely the Catholic Church. The Church had become big landowners in the colonial era, and they used their land not just to build churches on top of, but they would also start farms on their many, many acres that's outside of the church building itself. So the Catholic Church was a big landowner and also a big economic entity because they're also producing agricultural products and selling them on markets. So the church is, in many countries, one of the biggest landowner in the country. And the church had gone into basically banking. They would use a lot of their excess money that they were generating from these businesses to give loans out to investors that need money to start a business or whatever. So the church is also acting like a major Latin American banking system. So they were giving out loans and making lots of money off of interest payments. So the Catholic Church was a massive economic entity that had a very large income, a very large revenue on a yearly basis. And of course, used that revenue to buy access to political power And a lot of Latin American politicians after independence, especially in the late 1800s, start making moves to try to break the church's economic power in individual countries. The major way that they usually did it was to pass laws that gave the government the ability to confiscate what they called extra church lands. Basically, the government will take over the church farmlands, and the church gets to keep the land that has its church building on top of. So the government can confiscate those lands and put them up for auction to the highest bidder. And they largely did the same with a lot of native reservations in their countries, because they accused the natives of not really running the land very effectively or efficiently. So they'd also often confiscate a lot of native reservation land that a lot of the natives depended on for their survival. So that created two major results. Number one, it broke down the church's economic power in the country, and it also turned a lot of natives into landless job seekers. Basically, they need to go find work in order to make wages in order to survive. So just like a lot of the Industrial Revolution in Europe or the United States, the Industrial Revolution basically required a large jobless population to go into the factories and become the industrial workforce. So a lot of natives in many different Latin American countries would become that basically destitute workforce that would go in and be the industrial workers. So that's a lot of the big economic changes we see happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And we also start to see the normal type of social and economic and political changes that we generally see across countries as they industrialize. So Europe had gone through this in the early and mid 1800s for the most part. The United States was undergoing it in the late 1800s, really at the same time as Latin America will start to go through it in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And this will have big changes for the three major kind of social classes that will be in place by around 1930. Number one is that the big landowners, the big wealthy landowners, the caudillos, who had basically run the Latin American nations in the 1800s, they start to transform themselves in the late 1800s from just basically big landowners who dominate the agricultural economy. And as the Industrial Revolution starts to take off country by country, many of those big landowners will use their excess wealth, the money that they have made off of agriculture, to become industrial investors. So they will become basically industrial capitalists. They will take the extra money that they had laying around from their farms, their big lands, and they will invest that quite often into building factories and buying up the machines or hiring the scientists and advisors to get the factories off the ground. And therefore the old landowners basically transform themselves, those who survive this process will transform themselves into the capitalist elite, those factory owners who will make such astronomically large profits in the late 1800s and early 1900s that they will basically take control over governments through bribery, through what we would today call the campaign finance system. They'll take their extra money and give it to politicians to win elections, and then the politicians are under their control or influence for the long term afterward. So the landowners who turn into capitalist owners, factory owners, what Marx called the means of production, that motivates these new capitalist owners, what Marx called basically the bourgeoisie, to get involved in politics in order to protect their future position. They want a seat at the table to influence government policy, to keep their tax rates low, to make sure no governments pass any laws that would allow for like labor unionization or minimum wages or anything that would harm the elite's profit margin from their factories. So that is what the elite are doing the wealthiest of the wealthy in this era. And as industrialization gets going, economists and intellectuals that studied the Industrial Revolution didn't really expect this to happen. But a new class of workers rises that we generally call the middle class. People who get college degrees and they become clerks or bureaucrats or kind of middle managers within these giant industrial companies that run factories. They are the ones that will, basically manage the companies. And there's a whole bunch of other more highly educated, what we call white collar workers that are not industrial workers. They're not kind of menial laborers. They are more like brain workers. They study statistics, or they move investments around, or they're mostly just kind of office workers and bankers or teachers or university professors or lawyers, or even the amount of doctors, medical doctors, starts to grow in society as you get more and more medical inventions and technology and scientific discoveries. So this whole middle class of more highly paid workers, clerks and corporate managers and university professors and doctors and lawyers, are paid fairly well. So they're usually around the kind of wealthiest 10% or so in any individual country, and still even today. So they kind of come out of nowhere, and Karl Marx didn't even predict that this would happen. So they will become, over time, as they grow and their incomes grow, they will become a very loud and powerful voice in politics because they are paid pretty well. I mean, again, they're the wealthiest 10% of the country, so they can also use their extra wealth to maybe run for office in politics, or to contribute to a politician's campaign in order to influence them later when they're in office. So the landowners and the capitalist investors, the bourgeoisie, they're usually about the richest 1% or so, maybe 2 or 3 or 4%. The middle class make up the rest of the richest 10%, so they're like the 90th percentile up to about the 97th or 98th percentile of incomes. And then you've largely got everybody else, the so-called working class, the people that are left over as farmers. Still in Latin America, somewhere around a half of all workers in society, even in the mid-1900s, are still farmers, depending on exactly which country you're talking about. So the working classes are largely farmers. There's still some slavery around in 1800. And the growing amount of factory workers. So these workers are the lowest paid. They're usually about 80 to 90% of the population of any individual country. Sometimes like small shop owners or small business owners can be considered in the working class because they work so many long hours and they don't make huge amounts of money. And the working class will start to largely make demands themselves, basically for a bigger slice of the pie. They want bigger incomes. They want minimum wages or guarantees of wages or something like this. And their tactic to achieve that is largely to try to form labor unions, especially in the industrial factories. So workers in steel factories will try to unionize and use their collective identity as steel workers to basically threaten their managers to go on strike or to basically give them what they want. So the workers' power is really pretty much economic. They can start strikes that would shut down a factory or shut down a railroad or a transportation system. So they're basically holding the owners of those systems at bay through really just labor extortion. If you get your union together and they vote to take a strike, then they just don't go to work and the factory can't operate. Or whatever system they work in, it just can't work. It just can't run. And therefore that harms the profit margin for the owners, and that is what is Post doing this theory encouraged the owners to come and negotiate with the union leaders to form some kind of agreement on wages and working conditions, but basic kind of union contract for the workers. And one thing that we start to see over time is as these unions become more successful at getting their demands met, the unions will basically charge each individual worker what are called union dues. They take a small slice, 1 or 5 or maybe even 10% of the worker's income, their weekly pay, and that money goes to the union to pay for professional negotiators and researchers and whatnot to get the contracts in the first place. So a lot of these unions become big revenue sources themselves. They often control lots of money, and they will also get involved in politics by giving campaign donations to politicians that they want to see win office in order to, again, just like the wealthy factory owners, to influence government policy into the future. So we'll see several kind of big political results start to emerge by the early 1900s. The elite, the landowners that have turned into capitalist factory owners, they almost always say that they support democracy, that they really like democracy because it's so based in equality. But in reality, a lot of the elite, as much as they say they love democracy, they don't really want to see it implemented in reality. They often argue that voting rights should be limited to only the people who know how to read and write at a high level. So you'll get literacy tests in order to be allowed to vote, which would generally exclude the working class because they're out working in farms and factories all day, virtually every day. So they don't even ever really go to school. So they cannot pass the literacy test to get a vote. But again, the capitalists and the landowners, they often create political parties largely to fight against each other because they've been running the government for so long that they have long-term arguments against each other. And one thing that we see especially start to happen in the early 1900s is that the capitalist elite will basically start to make deals with the middle class politically. Because the middle class are more highly educated generally, they can pass a literacy test to get a vote. So the capitalist elite, the richest in the country, they will start making political deals with the middle class, basically offering voting rights to them or some other permissions to let them let middle class members run in elections so they can hold office also. But all these deals are entirely intended to bring the middle class into politics in order to separate them from the working class. The biggest fear that the landowners and the capitalist factory owners always have is that the workers, the middle class and the working class, are someday going to unite against them, against the elite. And if they do so, then they can basically, start a revolution or something, or maybe just, demand changes in the government so that the working class all get a vote also, and then they could just have a democracy and they just vote for whoever they want. And they'll pretty much always win elections because they're at least somewhere around 96, 97, 98% of the population. So that's the one thing that the factory owners and the big landowners always fear, is that the middle class will join with the working class in some type of movement to get more power for themselves. So the landowners and the factory owners start making deals with the middle class to basically create some kind of political system that will favor the middle class and convince them to separate from the working class and leave them behind. And when they do this, this also tends to create a whole new type of middle class person, which is the professional politician who goes into office or runs for office, and even if they don't win their election, they often become an advisor to the office holders, or they become a government bureaucrat. But it's people whose entire careers are basically spent in politics one way or the other, so they never really have any other job. They are not the lawyers or teachers or whoever. They are professional politicians who pass laws or debate laws or work in the bureaucracy somehow or something like that. And that is what we will see kind of lead to the end of the Caudillo era, when the middle class starts to gain more and more political power in these individual countries. So now we'll start to kind of talk about the relationship between the countries we're going to kind of examine for the rest of today, and why we are examining them, basically. The major reason is really population size. Most of the countries we're going to talk about today are the big population centers of Latin America in the early 1900s. So we're going to talk about Chile, Brazil, Peru, Argentina, Colombia. These are the countries that have the biggest populations. We're going to save talking about Mexico for next time, because there's a lot of details of their evolution that become very important as a kind of paradigm for the rest of Latin America. So we'll treat Mexico all in its own separate lecture. And Venezuela is the one kind of exception to all this. They have a big population, but they get involved in this kind of stuff much later. But why is large population so important? It's because investors tend to build factories in countries that have large populations, because the factories are needed to mass produce enough goods to supply a large population. Industrialization tends not to happen very much in places that have small populations, because it's just not really needed. Small populations don't need big factories to mass produce goods for their society, because the population is small enough to survive on the old system of basically handcrafted goods. So large populations tend to lead to industrialization, and as we just talked about, industrialization tends to lead to the creation of a middle class and a working class of factory workers. And it's those two classes who will therefore create the mass political parties that we're going to talk about, that will challenge the elite, the large landowners and the big factory owners by the early 1900s. Will challenge those groups for more political power in government. So this is the basic kind of flow chart that we're working with. Large populations tend to lead to industrialization, which create the middle class and the working classes, who will start the political fights against the elite for more power for themselves, if not to be the dominant power in a country. So we'll see how this plays out in several countries in Latin America for the rest of today. And the first is in Chile. So Chile is one of the earlier countries to start major unionizing attempts amongst the workforce, even as far back as the 1870s. So they also have a president, Jose Balmaceda, who in the late 1880s started proposing increasing tariffs, taxes on imports, especially on beef, and especially on beef from Argentina. So that outraged a lot of the working class, because they rely on low beef prices in order to survive. I mean, that's their staple food, basically. That's what they buy to eat on a daily basis. So if the prices of beef go up, which is what tariffs usually cause to happen, the middle and working class realize that their food costs are going to go up on a daily basis, and they're not very happy about that. And this also tended to anger foreign investors, who did not like the idea of having to pay higher taxes in the first place. So this really pushes Balmaceda to withdraw the argument, to withdraw the idea, and that pushes his rival party, the party who was arguing against him, to keep expanding its demands. and argue not just to get rid of this tax increase that the president had been talking about, but further to argue for more gains for the poor and the middle class. Things like government-run education system, an actual democracy where most of the workers would have a vote. So that's where a lot of these calls in Chile really get started in the 1880s. And by 1900, they've developed several different major political parties. And there are three big ones that really splits the vote. Three kind of working class parties. So whenever there's an election, whenever they get to vote, they split their vote, and that tends to keep the landowners in power for quite a while because the landowners all unify behind their chosen candidates. So this convinces the working classes, especially, to even increase their unionizing attempts in the early 1900s. And they became increasingly organized and militant by about 1910. So they stage a lot of protests. They go on strike in different industries fairly often, and even violently go on strike after 1905. So they continue to push the government to improve working conditions, to create a welfare system, to create a workers' compensation system for workers that are injured on the job, to create pension systems for railroad workers. So all this is going on in the 19-teens. And one politician named Alessandri saw this rise in worker militancy and voting power, and was one of the first kind of major politicians in Chile to realize that he could take advantage of that. And if he ran for a high office, making promises to those groups of voters, that he could get elected fairly easily. So he ran for president in 1920 and basically promised to give all unions in the country legal status, and which would give them a certain amount of government protection against their employers using pretty shady tactics to break the unions. So this was a big deal in Chile, the 1920 election, and Alessandri Palma eventually barely won the 1920 election. And in 1921, his first year in office, opened debates on a major labor code and social welfare proposals that would improve the plight of workers and their unions pretty dramatically. The problem, though, is that the old landowning type conservative party had kept a congressional majority in those elections, so he opened debate, but he had to get the Congress to pass his proposal into law, and they basically just stalled it for several years until 1924, when the military intervened and basically overthrew Alessandri and kicked him out of office. So that was the end of the big debates, but it shows a lot of progress for unions in Chile in the early 1900s, that they were able to get to that point in the first place where they got their president, their chosen candidate, in office, and started getting closer and closer to major legal reforms that would benefit themselves. Brazil in 1880 largely lacked modern technology. They lacked industrial infrastructure, and they still had basically an agricultural-based economy. And any attempts at Brazilian industrialization were almost totally reliant on foreign investors or foreign advisors who Brazil or Brazilian investors had to pay to come into Brazil to try to figure out how to start building factories or get their industrialization off the ground. So industrialization doesn't really pick up speed in Brazil until right around World War II in the 1940s. And at that point, that's when industrialization gets going well enough to start supplying Brazil's markets and to start selling Brazilian goods on the world market, industrial goods. And around that time, it's also when you see the so-called middle class of higher educated professionals start to rise. And Brazil has the biggest population in Latin America and still does today. So most of the kind of more highly educated middle class type workers, they generally live in the bigger cities because that's where the affluence is, and that's where the factories will be built. So that's where the major companies are located. Another problem that Brazil had in the early 1900s is that the central government doesn't really have a whole lot of power. Most political power in Brazil is basically separated into the provinces. So like the United States has 50 states, it would be like the 50 states really run the country instead of the central government in Washington, D.C. And each province, each locality, had its own what we call political machines, groups of politicians who have figured out how to dominate the elections in their area in order to stay in office election after election, no matter how corrupt they are. And those political machines tend to run Brazil's political system by and large. And they're the ones who largely determine who the national president is. But in 1926, you get the start of a new political party that mostly rose up on criticizing that machine-based political system and demanding more free elections. So a lot of the urban city living middle class, the kind of highly educated professionals, generally join that political party that is complaining about the machines. And then you get the 1929 U.S. stock market crash and the depression that followed, which does a lot of harm to Brazil's economy. Because again, Brazil is not heavily industrialized yet, so there's still an agricultural economy that depends on foreign populations buying their food, and in Brazil's case, largely coffee. And coffee is really a kind of luxury good. You don't need it for survival. So whenever you get a depression or a recession or any kind of economic downturn, people trying to save money because they're worried about losing their job, they stop buying luxury goods. They start only buying the things that are, for survival. So they're focused on buying food and water, and not so much coffee or wine or anything like that. So Brazil's economy is very heavily damaged in the Great Depression, and coffee that could not be sold basically piled up in warehouses around the country. And in 1930, you're going to have a presidential election in Brazil, and where the corrupt machines ran their kind of official candidate, and a separate candidate will rise up named Getulio Vargas. So he runs for president, actually lost in that election in 1930, but got such a large portion of the vote that he accused the government of running a fraudulent election to keep him out of office. And he had so many followers, so many supporters, that they start protesting in large numbers. And many of the individual provinces supported Vargas. And so some of those provinces took their state militias basically and joined them together and sent them to the capital city to help Vargas push his claim to power. And eventually those militias outnumbered the national military and forced the president, who had claimed that he won the election, forced him to resign. And so Vargas took office basically in a military coup, not from the central government's military, but from these kind of private militias sent from the individual provinces. So Vargas was in power largely due to a conflict amongst the political elite. It was a conflict between the central government and some of the provinces. And he was put in power and kept in power largely to stop a civil war from breaking out. So Vargas largely governed by decree because the legislature was not in session when all of this happened and he first went into office. His next big step is to replace pretty much all of the governors of the individual provinces because he didn't trust them. So he replaced them with his own loyalists, basically in order to run the provinces to not be a problem for him, and to run it to keep him in power. So this largely destroyed a lot of those state-based or provincial machines, because Vargas basically decapitated them. Didn't really kill them, but cut off their access to power at the top. So only Vargas's loyalists are now running the individual provincial governments. And he also pushed through a new constitution for Brazil in 1934. It's finished in 34, but they start kind of debating it and passing resolutions and whatnot in 33. And this constitution makes a lot of big changes to Brazil's governing structure. Number one, it reduced the authority of the individual provinces. So before, the provinces had a lot of power to pass their own laws and tax rates, especially on taxes on goods that are coming in from one province. So basically goods that are traveling from one province to another. So the new constitution dramatically reduced the provinces' autonomy, their own individual power to pass all those kinds of policies for their own province. So the central government in this constitution is hugely empowered to pass national tax rates. It kept a direct presidential election, so there will continue being presidential elections, and the first of them would be held in a few years, and the Constitution also handed Vargas the first presidential term. And the Constitution also heavily restricted the foreign ownership of land, or the amount of immigrants who could be employed in middle class or government positions. So you can see through these many steps, especially Vargas kind of taking over the provincial governments. Vargas ran for office in a democracy, but once he's in power, he basically starts building a dictatorship to stay in power. And he'll stay in power until 1934, then basically the next presidential election, and then he'll leave office, but he'll eventually come back later when he runs for election again, and he'll do the same thing all over again. He'll build another dictatorship once he gets into power later. So that's very quickly how Brazil is kind of transitioning toward more centralized power and building up a dictatorship system by the 1930s. So next country is Argentina. Argentina's general history throughout this whole era, about 40 or 50 years or so, is to see the rise of a middle class and a working class, and that they will push for more power, and they will eventually get a democracy. But the results of that democracy, the voting from year to year or election to election, basically goes back and forth between an open democracy and a military dictatorship, because that's the only way that the old landowning and factory owning elite can try to cling to power in any way. So Argentina's economic growth in the late 1800s is actually pretty fast. It was largely reliant on agriculture. So it's the same old system. They're selling their extra agriculture around the world to get the money to invest in building their industrial revolution. And one of the big things that's different about Argentina by the early 1900s is they're taking in huge amounts of immigrants, largely from Europe, Italy, Spain, and even in southern and eastern Europe. So immigrants are really flooding into Argentina to the point by about 1930, historians believe that about 60% of the Argentinian population are immigrants, or the children of immigrants. So that largely solved Argentina's long-term economic problem, which was a labor shortage, but also brought in a lot of kind of cultural debates about what does it mean to be Argentinian, because so much immigration has come in that it has largely changed culture in a lot of ways. And of course, now that you have this booming population size, that will encourage industrialization also to take place because they need factories to start mass producing the goods that the population relies on. And once industrialization gets going, that will foster a middle class of corporate managers and government bureaucrats and people to run the railroads and teachers and on and on and on, bankers, lawyers, and other types of investors. So we get the same old story that that this rising middle class and the working class that are still on the farms or starting to work in the growing factories, they start demanding more and more political power as they start to be a kind of growing part of the population. So they start demanding democracy, and because a lot of them are newly arriving from Europe, they also bring a lot of radical kind of leftist political ideas, which are largely kind of communism or even anarchy. So there's a large anarchist movement in Europe at the time, which basically advocates to get rid of government and just let people live with as little laws and police forces as possible. So those two kind of leftist political ideas, anarchism and communism, scare the elite very badly. But the elite, the landowning and the factory-owning elite, they keep getting richer, which is what they tend to do over the years in industrializing nations. And they continue trying to stop the workforces from organizing, from forming labor unions. But the urbanizing workers, they tend to try to unionize, often according to European normal types of unions, steel workers unions, or even early middle class unions like unions of railroad managers or something like that, or unions of bankers or something. Lawyers unions are often the first in the United States that really get going for the middle class, but that'll be later in the mid-1900s. One of the big developments in Argentina was the residence law that passed in 1902. So basically the wealthy conservatives, the landowning elite, the factory-owning elite, were so afraid of all these immigrants and the amount of the population that's growing so quickly that is demanding voting power, that in 1902, the kind of conservative party passed a major law that gave the government the power to deport any foreigner who participated in any protests or strikes or anything that could threaten the national security of the country or that disturbed public order. So a lot of these labor union strikes, they actually turn very violent because the workers go on strike. They often try to picket or surround the factory to stop any replacement workers from getting in. And then the owners call out like private guards or private investigators, or sometimes even the local police or the national military to attack the striking workers and push them out of the area so the owners could hire replacement workers and keep the factories running. So a lot of these strikes really break down into violence, into riots outside the factory. So in passing this residence law in 1902 that said that any foreigner could be immediately deported for disturbing the public order. I mean, that's what a lot of these unionizing workers are forced to do in a lot of instances. So this residence law is seen as a kind of conservative reaction against unionizing forces of the working class. And one of the biggest general strikes, biggest strikes in all of Argentina's early history, was called in 1919. And a general strike is a strike across industries. It's not just a strike of workers in a certain factory or workers in a certain industry like railroad workers or something like that. It is a general strike of all workers. And so that's intended to grind the whole national economy down to a halt. and forced the government and the elite owners of the factories and the railroads and all those things to give in to worker demands. And the worker demands in 1919 are basically higher wages. And the conservative elite basically sent their forces, their police forces and sometimes even paramilitary forces, into the streets to attack the strikers because they're often protesting and marching down the street instead of going to work. So it's estimated that hundreds of people are killed in all this in 1919 in Argentina. And the workers often blame their own failed politicians from the so-called Radical Party that had promised to get gains for the workers. Didn't work in this instance. So they often blame their own politicians that they had supported before. And they also obviously blame the kind of conservative groups and the military who had supported the wealthy elite in all of this. And in the midst of all this, the kind of worker-based parties start to win elections afterward. They make even bigger promises to the working class. And the workers, once they get a vote, they start electing this certain, they call it the Liberal Party. They start to win virtually all elections through 1928 and into the 1930s. And the 1930s did not really harm Argentina's economy so much. It did some harm, but it didn't really disrupt the political system or even force through any kind of major political reforms. Argentina's exports, especially agriculture, continue being exported and sold on the world markets at a pretty good rate. And the farmers who were largely hurt by the Depression were very often new immigrants who could not vote in the first place. The group that's really making big demands in the 1930s are really the middle class. So you'll continue to get this great battle between the middle class and the working class versus the elite. And it's a political battle from one election after another. And eventually the elite try to go back to voting fraud after 1940 in order to stay in power. They desperately cling to power as closely as they can. So that's going to be another fight in Argentina. It's going to lead to more social and political conflict in Argentina in the 1940s that we'll get to in a future lecture. And the next country we'll talk about is Colombia. Colombia's economy was largely dominated through coffee. So coffee is their big export in the late 1800s. And coffee is it's a pretty intensive process. It requires a lot of manual labor. Coffee trees don't even mature for about 6 years to the point where you can start harvesting the coffee beans from them. So it takes a lot of long-term investment and a lot of labor to basically get the coffee beans out of the ground. So it was a gigantic and long-term investment for Colombian landowners. And Colombia also had another big problem in the late 1800s, and that's what became known as the War of 1,000 Days, which is basically a Colombian civil war between a liberal party and a conservative party. That the conservatives eventually won, but this is also when the United States takes advantage of this war in order to back a Panamanian independence movement in order to break Panama away from Colombia so that the United States can get a deal to build a canal through Panama. So that's all happening at the same time, right around the turn of the century. But the lessons that the Colombian politicians learned from the Civil War is that it was so destructive that they want to avoid it in the future. So they start a policy and kind of pass a rule in their government called convivencia, which basically means that their debates are not allowed to get too heated. They can argue with each other, but their arguments are not allowed to get angry or violent in order to stop the kind of discord and the conflict that led to the Civil War. the War of a Thousand Days. So that's their general kind of internal government policy. They can debate things, but they're not supposed to really get out of control. It's supposed to be kept very kind of polite. Labor unions will start getting very active in the 19-teens in Colombia, and they'll start a series of strikes in the 1920s, the biggest of which happened in 1928 in Cienega. So this was a giant strike of banana workers. And the sitting president at the time ordered Colombian soldiers into the area to break the strike and send the workers back to the fields, basically. And this led to a massacre. Several hundred strikers and even some soldiers were killed in this. And this is largely pushed by the United States Fruit Company, the U.S. Fruit Company, that is one of the big banana plantation owners throughout Latin America at the time, and will continue to be through the 1940s. So this happens right on the edge of what we now know as the Great Depression. And the Depression caused major problems for Colombia, largely through an investment bubble. A lot of Colombian landowners had borrowed huge amounts of money to buy land in Colombia and start planting coffee trees. But again, the coffee trees take 6 years to mature. So those landowners who had taken on big loans and had planted coffee trees in just a couple of years or so before the Depression hit, they're pretty much wiped out because they've got trees that are not producing, but they also have big loan payments to make. So the Colombian government has to act fast in order to avoid a total disaster. So the Colombian government devalued its currency, and basically destroyed a lot of those coffee trees and destroyed a lot of the coffee harvest. They just burned it in order to push down supply on the worldwide market, which would push up demand and lead to higher prices for the coffee that remained. So Colombia's economic policy was pretty vicious, but it worked. The Colombian economy recovered faster than virtually any other Latin American economy during the Great Depression. And that quick recovery will restart the working class movements to unionize. That will become very powerful again, especially in the 1940s. And the next country we'll move on to is Peru. And Peru's general history throughout all this is basically the conservatives and the landowners will use violence to stay in power and try to use dictatorship powers of one sort or another to try to keep the working masses at bay. So Peru's economy around the early 1900s is really doing pretty well, even though they had lost big chunks of their southern part of their country and their coastline to Chile in the War of the Pacific. So even though they had lost some land, the other areas that Peru retains, the crops that they grow in those areas suddenly go through a big economic boom in the early 1900s. So sugar, cotton, wool, rubber, those are all kind of booming industries, and so that really helps out the Peruvian recovery from that war. And so the landowners in Peru are hugely enriched by this, and they're also able to keep labor prices down by using what we usually call in the United States a sharecropping system, which kept their laborers, largely African immigrants and Native Americans, kept them pretty economically repressed and tied to the land. So the big landowners in Peru are basically plantation owners with sharecropping employees that tends to keep their wages very low and therefore keep the profits for the landowners very high. But in the big cities where industrialization is going to start, a lot of those urban workers, not just factory workers but also the rising middle class, they start political movements also in the early 1900s. And their big success is to push for the election of a populist president Guillermo Billinghurst in 1912. So he's a populist who pushes through several major government reforms, like public housing, government-built housing for the poor, a law that made an 8-hour workday the norm in Peruvian society, and allowed collective bargaining rights, basically unionization rights, to workers who wanted to form unions and negotiate with their managers. So the landowning and factory-owning conservatives hated this guy so much that they deposed him, basically. They kicked him out of office. In 1914, because he, at that point, started calling on the working masses to pour into the streets in mass protest movements and demonstrations to push for even more populist policies than what they had already gotten. So that was enough for the rich elite to want to get rid of him, so they kicked him out of office in 1914. They replaced him with a fairly moderate reformer, a guy who wanted some reforms, but not nearly to the extent that Billinghurst did. And that president, named Pardo, Juan Jose Pardo, was probably most famous in this era for calling out the army to attack another worker and university student protest movement in 1919. And at that point, elections were held in 1919, which Augusto Leguía won. But Leguía is so worried about possibly being not even allowed to be inaugurated as president. So before he even gets to his day where he assumes office, he's worried that the conservatives in Congress are going to block him from even taking office. So he formed a coup against the sitting government before his own inauguration, put the sitting president Pardo into exile, and then dissolved the Congress entirely and built a dictatorship under himself. So he's in office from 1919 for 10 years, mostly trying to stay in power, stay in control by any means necessary. And he's largely in power until the Great Depression hits Peru in 1930. And then the army knocked him out of office and replaced him with a military officer. And then that new government in 1930 called elections for the next year, so you're going to have another round of elections in 1931. And that's where you start to get a student-led group called the American Revolutionary Alliance Party, or APRA, based on the Spanish version of that title. So this is largely a kind of leftist, pro-worker, and a university student-led new political party that ran in the elections in 1931 on platforms opposed to social inequality and imperialism. They lost those elections. So a new president is elected in 31 who goes into office. But an APRA follower tried to assassinate that new president in 1932. The president survived, but the military and that president, they largely blamed this political party for starting rounds of instability and attempts at insurrection. And the biggest insurrection led by APRA is at Trujillo in July 1932. So this is literally an uprising against the government. And that sitting president who had survived the assassination obviously hated this political party because they had tried to kill him, or he blamed them for trying to kill him. So he sent a bunch of the army into the area around Trujillo to attack this, what he rightly called an insurrection. And the soldiers attacked and killed somewhere around 1,000 or so suspected insurgents. So that's, the political party, APRA, considers this an atrocity. But many of the resistant leaders were able to capture soldiers and even military officers and police officers that took part in this attack on this group in Trujillo, and executed them. So there's atrocities on both sides that historians have recognized and documented around Trujillo in July. And the military after that grew to hate this political party so much and view them as a constant threat to government stability that the Peruvian military will take a stance to never let APRA win an election. And even if they win an election, to never let their candidates actually go into office. So the Peruvian military hates this political party, views it as basically a revolutionary group, and takes the stand basically to never allow them into political power. Especially after another APRA follower successfully assassinated that president in 1933, the guy who had survived the first assassination attempt in 1932. So when that president named Cerro was actually assassinated in 1933, they need someone else to run the government. So Congress appoints a general from the army named Oscar Benavides to basically fulfill the rest of the presidential term. So Benavides goes into office at a time where his number one job is to rebuild political stability, to stop these insurrections, to stop these assassination attempts. But he also largely inherits a growing economy. So the Great Depression's economic damage on Peru had already been done by 1933. Benavides had been president before the 19-teens, so he's a lot of people saw him as fairly trustworthy. He's the guy who had replaced the former populist president who the military kicked out in 1914. So he had been in office for a couple years until an election, basically elected someone else. So he makes a comeback in 1932 when the Congress appoints him to be president for at least a little while until they hold new elections. But his economic policies are overall pretty solid. He is very interested in getting Peru to develop its own industry, develop its own industrial companies, and really take control over its own natural resources and kick a lot of foreign investors out, or just outproduce them, or even possibly confiscate their property, their businesses. So Benavides' government in the 1930s is very much interested in basically what historians tend to call independent development. They want Peru to run an industrial revolution for Peru, to benefit the Peruvian people, and they do not want to rely on foreigners to do it, or foreign money to do it. They want to do it themselves. And they want to really turn the corner on the Industrial Revolution and build up their country to be an independent, powerful country that can resist any outside influence. So their general policy is to do that, or to build up a state-owned or government-owned oil company to develop Peru's oil reserves, to drill the oil, to get it out of the ground, and to sell it for profit on the worldwide market. They also look to stabilize the currency, to promote public works, things like roads, more housing developments, a social security system, and basically to modernize the country. They also look to create a government-run agricultural bank that would extend loans to landowners and possible industrial companies, basically to break their reliance on foreign bankers. So the government will run its own bank, basically, to give loans to Peruvian people to start industrial businesses or to expand their farming enterprises. And the next two presidents after Benavides, going into the 1940s, largely continue these policies to diversify the economy and to continue to invest in industrialization, independent development. But after the 1940s, future elections will basically go back and forth in Peru between democratically elected leaders and military or conservatives groups that often don't like what those democratically elected leaders do, because they're those ones that are elected through the democracy. They have to fulfilling their campaign promises to the working masses who elected them. So there's largely a contest between the democratically elected leadership and the conservative military faction that want to stop those, what they see as kind of radical reforms. So Peru will go back and forth in their elections over time, where some populist, worker-supported politicians win an election and they start implementing populist reforms, and then the military just knocks them out of office through a coup. So we'll see that continue to develop in Peru into the mid-1900s. And the United States will also get involved in that also, as we'll talk about in later lectures. So we'll stop here for today, and next time we'll start going into much more detail on the Mexican Revolution.